Hello again, this is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I'd like to reintroduce to you one of my favorite authors. I know I say that a lot, but I really like this man, James Emery White. He's a good author. He's a pastor, excellent speaker, just somebody that I really enjoy listening to and enjoy reading his material. Just to give you an idea, James Sire, who's an author of another really good book called The Universe Next Door, said God wants us to have the mind of Christ, but what is that mind and how do we get it? James Emery White answers these questions in some of the most lucid prose being written today. A pleasure to read, a joy to take his advice. So the book, James Emery White, he's got several good ones. This one's called A Mind for God. I like that a lot. We're supposed to be thinkers, aren't we? Isn't that what it means to be human? In 2 Corinthians 10, Paul says we're supposed to take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we're not doing that. And that's what James Emery White is concerned about. We're not developing good intellectual habits. Our minds have been captured by the culture. Actually, that's what's going on. We're not changing the culture to us. We're letting culture change us to it. And so he tells things that we can do about that. Now, what I've done two other podcasts in the past on this book, but I didn't do the intro. So I wanted to do the intro in chapter 1. I kind of bounced around. He starts with a story, and I bet some of you have heard stories like this, or maybe you've been part of it. He said his oldest daughter was at a leading university in the U.S. He doesn't name it, and you can see why. She took a history course there, and her professor said this. He said, well, you know that the entire historical record that Christianity is based on is untrue. What do you mean? Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah. None of his followers saw him as divine until centuries later. The Gospels are not first-hand accounts. Jesus was not really as much a religious leader as he was a political one. There was never an intent during that time to form any kind of church. There were actually a lot of Gospels, not just 4, dozens of them, and they're all thought to be sacred. 4 Gospels today are just riddled with discrepancies and errors. And he says that his daughter, to pass her first exam, had to write things like this: that Jesus was born in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. She had to deny the Pauline authorship of 1 Timothy. She had to maintain that the 4 Gospels that we think of today as the ones that are the biographies of Jesus, that'd be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that they're in complete disagreement about the major facts around the death of Jesus, like when he was crucified, whether it was after Passover, before, whether Judas really committed suicide. So White steps back from that story and he said, that's a tame story. He said it's much worse than that in many places in colleges. He says there was a recent study of faculty members at U.S. colleges and universities. They found that 2/3 were either strongly or somewhat agreeable with the idea that homosexuality was as acceptable as heterosexuality. 84% supported abortion rights. 75% supported extramarital cohabitation. Fewer than 1/3 said that they are regular churchgoers. So no wonder there's a concern out there. Chuck Colson said this: there was a lack of viewpoint diversity, and he found that to be deeply disturbing. Yeah. He said, look what's going on today. We've got all sorts of attacks on Christianity. That's not the problem. It's been our reaction. But he said, look at the Da Vinci Code, for example. It came out in the early 2000s. A huge seller. It suggested Jesus was not divine. He was sexually involved with Mary, bore a child. You got Star Wars that propagates Eastern pantheistic thought. You got culture wars over homosexuality, gay marriage. We got politics. We got debates regarding evolution, intelligent design. And he said, here's the problem. Our minds are not keeping up. He said, this is a time of peril and promise. He said, the peril is that we've got all these people that are hungry for ideas. And what do we have today in the Christian world? He said they're often found to be empty, passive, and don't really engage with the world. He said the promise, right? So that's the peril. He said the promise is that the Christians can stride forward and that we should be engaging the world because it's looking for answers. And it's finding answers in all the wrong places. He said that's not the first time that Christianity has had a chance to remake society in a good way. He goes back to Thomas Cahill's book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. And it's a great story, by the way. It's a wonderful book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. I read it and enjoyed it. He said Ireland had a moment of glory. The Roman Empire collapsed, and barbarians just kind of took over Roman cities. They were looting, they were burning books. And what were the Irish doing? They were isolated, right? They were way off by themselves. And they took up the great labor of copying all of Western literature. And then missionary-minded Irish monks brought back all of that good stuff from their isolated island back to the continent. So they basically refounded European civilization. And that's how the Irish saved civilization. So that's a really good point. He said, we may end up having to do that as well. People are awash in all sorts of secular ideas. Can we come back and bring back Christianity to them? He said, we need habits of the mind. So Winston Churchill said that in 1943. The empires of the future will be empires of the mind. Yeah. So it's ideologies. It's going to be ideas, not nations, that will captivate and conquer in the future. And he said the starting point for the conquest of the world would now be the human mind. He said, well, we need more than the Irish to save us. He quotes John Stott. We may talk of conquering the world for Christ, but what sort of conquest do we mean? Not a victory by force of arms. He says, this is Stott now, this is a battle of ideas. And White says, but we've got very few warriors right now. He said people follow Christ. Yes, they do. But he said they've retreated, many of them, into personal piety, just trying to be good people and be good neighbors and do good works. He said Christians are offering feelings and philanthropy, giving to others. But he said we need some hard thinking. He said, are there any hard thinkers left? So he says the peril today is that when a Christian mind is most needed, when we really need to hear from Christians in good, logical, sophisticated thinking, he said Christians don't say much about the value of the mind, and they don't develop it. That's really sad. He said, that devaluation of the intellect is a recent development within the annals of Christian history. So we had some wonderful Christian thinkers and intellects, and we've kind of kicked that away. We've said basically, well, as long as I know Jesus is in my heart, that's good enough. But that doesn't really cut it with today's society. He said the earliest church fathers said, if we want to be fully human, what does that mean? We have to think. We're Homo sapiens. That means thinking beings. He says we were made in God's image. And one of the most precious ways within that image that God gave us is the ability to think. So look at Isaiah 1:18. God implores the people there, come now, let us reason together. Think about Jesus. What did he say? We're supposed to be devoted to God, heart, soul, strength, and mind. He added that. That wasn't in the original that he was quoting from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy said that you're supposed to love your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Jesus said, and mind. So the Apostle Paul, what does he say? He said, we've got to be transformed. And how do you get transformed? This is Romans 12. It depends if our minds are engaged in an ongoing process of renewal. And he said, Harry Blamires, he's a student of C.S. Lewis's, he claimed, and this is really sad, he said, there is no longer a Christian mind. Yeah, we have a Christian ethic, and we have a Christian practice. We have a Christian spirituality. Yes, we have those. We don't have a Christian mind. And, of course, that was echoed more recently by Mark Noll. Wrote a book about the scandal of the evangelical mind. He said there's not much of an evangelical mind left. Here's what Noll said. If evangelicals do not take seriously the larger world of the intellect, what we're saying, in effect, is we want our minds to be shaped by the conventions of our modern universities and the assumptions of Madison Avenue, instead of by God and the servants of God. He says, back to White now, he said, if we don't have a Christian mind, we're going to be taken captive by the worldviews that are out there that are trying to get our attention. Or we're going to fail to make the Christian voice heard above that noise. He said, we got to think or we're going to lose the fight. And he said, that's the point of this book, to think Christianly. He said, we've got to develop our minds in light of a biblical worldview. Then we can think Christianly about the world. then we can respond to the culture and help that culture respond to the Christ we follow. And he quotes Paul here in 2 Corinthians 10. We do not wage war as the world does. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And so that's his challenge, and that's his introduction. So let's do this. Let me pick up the first chapter as well. It's called The Christian Mind, and he tells a story. He said he was studying at Oxford, and he was invited to a reception for visiting students, and he started talking to two women. One was from Florida, and one was from California. They said, "Well, what do you do for a living?" He said, "I'm a pastor of a church." The woman from Florida said, "Well, I'm glad somebody like you is at a place like this so you can give people the truth, the real story. Why don't more ministers do that?" "Well," I said, "I'm not sure I know what you're talking about." She said, "Well, all that stuff about Jesus having died on a cross, resurrected on the third day, and all those miracles. I mean, he never died like that. He lived a long, full life. He got married. He had kids." "Oh, really?" I said. "Don't you believe that?" She was incredulous. He said he didn't really want to get into a huge debate with her, but he said, "Wow." He said, "I'm sure there are those who might agree with you, but I confess I'm not one of them." "You mean you believe all of that stuff in the Bible?" "Yes." "You mean like the virgin birth?" "Yes." He says you could see it written all over her face. Here was a seemingly intelligent man studying at Oxford who said he believed the Bible. Kind of sad there. So he said, these kinds of conversations raise a question. What does it mean for a mind to be Christian? And he says one of the things he teaches his seminary students, because he's a teacher, one of the primary goals, he said, of Christian theology is to determine what is and what is not orthodoxy. In other words, he says there's right thinking and there's wrong thinking. Wrong thinking in theological terms is called heresy. He said there is a lot of heresy today. He quotes from a national study of youth and religion. Large. It was a big research project. And it asked Christians, it was talking about U.S. teenagers especially, who identified as Christian, what about the language of things like Trinity and holiness and sin and grace and justification and sanctification? What's happened to that language? He said, no, it's gone. According to this survey, what's showing up instead among Christian teenagers is language of happiness, niceness, and an earned heavenly award. Somebody said Christianity is actively being colonized and displaced by a quite different religious faith. And somebody's called this new faith moralistic therapeutic deism. You might have heard that before. Moralistic therapeutic deism. So what does that mean? It's a belief system that says, yes, there is a God, but he just wants us to be nice. And the central goal of life is for all of us to be happy and to feel good about ourselves. And God's not really needed in our daily life, maybe to take care of some problems that come our way. And good people do go to heaven, regardless of their religious convictions. He says that's not a Christian mind based on a biblical worldview. So again, do you hear that? Moralistic therapeutic deism. So moralistic means be nice. Therapeutic is I want to be better myself, so it's all about me. And the deism means this is a God who's more like a grandpa, right? He's just started things, and you're kind of on your own. He might come along to help you out, but he's not somebody that's challenging you to live your life in a particular way. He says, so what is a Christian mind based on biblical worldview? Well, it says it's not simply thinking done by those who consider themselves Christians. And he's got a great story. Jesus confronts Peter, and this is Matthew 16, and he says, away with you, Satan. You think as men think, not as God thinks. So White says it's not just thinking about Christian things, and it's not trying to adopt a Christian perspective on every issue. He said that comes out of a Christian mind. He quotes Os Guinness. By the way, you can see what he does here in his book, and he does that in a lot of his material. He takes surveys, he takes current events, he takes some excellent thinkers, and he mixes it all up as he gives really good answers. You find those in every chapter. So you know who else does it like that is Tim Keller. So I think Keller and James Emery White would have gotten along well together. Anyway, he quotes Os Guinness here. He says, thinking Christianly is thinking by Christians about anything and everything in a consistently Christian way. So the Christian faith isn't just a worldview, it's a faith which claims to be based on revelation, that we say that God has chosen to reveal himself and the truth about himself through Scripture. And you wouldn't know it any other way. So there's this great divide, he says, when it comes to how we approach the idea of thinking. There's a chasm. There either is something outside of ourselves that we have to take into account, or there is not. Yeah, and the Christians say there is, our mind operates under the belief that there is something outside of ourselves we have to take into account. What is that thing? God. So thinking in light of God's existence and his self-revelation is what it means to have a Christian mind. It's seeing the world in the light of faith. Or they say being a Christian realist. That's what Flannery O'Connor says about herself. Now, let me just introduce Flannery O'Connor real briefly, because he doesn't spend much time on her. He's going to have a quote from her, and I'll get to that in a second. But Flannery O'Connor, I've read a lot of her short stories. We've talked about them in class, because I do literature as well as composition classes. Flannery O'Connor was an American short story writer who was Christian, and she has some really fascinating stories. And just look her up sometime. O''Connor, first name Flannery, Flannery. Really thought-provoking stories. Now, she felt that she lived with a Christian mind in the presence of certain theological truths like creation and the fall of the human race and redemption. They were part of the nature of reality. That wasn't just her subjective belief. She thought that really was part of the world, as solid as the laws of physics. So for O'Connor, and this is how he's going to end this first chapter, for O'Connor, the Christian faith is not something without substance, without meaning. It's rooted in reality. And here's what she said. She had an article called Novelist and Believer. She says, it makes a great difference to the look of a novel whether its author believes the world came late into being and continues to come by a creative act of God, or whether he believes the world and ourselves are the product of a cosmic accident. It makes a great difference to his novel whether he believes that we are created in God's image, or whether he believes we create God in our own. It makes a great difference whether he believes that our wills are free or bound like those of other animals. So to hear, there's that split again, that big abyss, that big chasm between the idea that there's something beyond us or there isn't, right? There's a God, there's a theistic, this is a theistic world, or this is a non-theistic world. This is just a material world. All there is the stuff you can see and put under a microscope. And she's saying the same thing, that we either think the world came into being because of God or it was an accident. We either think that humans have a certain dignity, we're made in God's image, or we just are another animal. So he says that's the stark divide between a Christian mind. He calls the other kind a naturalistic mind, meaning a mind that in terms of truth and meaning accepts nothing out of the natural realm, out of the realm of nature. The Christian mind believes that God is on the loose. That's a good way of putting it. A naturalistic mind does not. A Christian mind believes this God brought forth truth and order, purpose, and authority into the created cosmos. What does a naturalistic mind think? There's no truth, no authority outside of ourselves and the naturalistic processes of the universe. He says there's the great divide. And that's the nature that sets the Christian mind apart from all others. He said that's the great challenge that we have to face as Christians as we deal with the modern world. So he hasn't, of course, given us answers and ways to deal with that yet. That will come later in his book. But I think that's just such an excellent way to get this thing off and running. He has some really good chapters, some contents that he'll get to that we've already done. I already covered, let's see, I did chapter 2. That was the cultural mind. In other words, how do people think these days? I did chapters 3 and 4. He talks about using the library and other tools of learning. So today it was the intro and chapter 1 called The Christian Mind. So we'll do some others. He's got some rules for the mind. I'll get to that. And then a chapter called Thinking Out Loud and book lists and resources. And you know what's nice? This book, it sounds like it'd be a monster of a book. It's as far as the actual, let me see here. It's about 115 pages. So you'd get through it quickly, and yet you'd have to slow down because there's so much good stuff on every page. Anything by James Emery White, I know you'd like. So this one's called A Mind for God. Well, I thank you for being part of the podcast today. I hope that was challenging. I hope we all think about developing a Christian mind. There's so much what I call compartmentalization today. People think Christianly on Sunday. That's easy to do. You go to church, you sing the songs, you talk to other friends when you're there, and you start thinking as a Christian. But what about Monday through Saturday? What we watch, what we listen to, what we read, our friends, our jobs, our leisure time, where we spend our money. Are we thinking Christianly during all those times? Maybe not. So he'll talk about Christian worldviews, and those are having a Christian worldview is so valuable. All right, well, I thank you again, and take care, and let's do another podcast together soon.